Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw a star in the east and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judea, are by no means the least amongst the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth the ruler, who will be shepherd of my people of Israel." Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star had appeared. And he sent to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me, so that I may come and worship him too." After hearing the king, they went on their way, and the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. After coming to the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they presented him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left to their own country, going another way. Now when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him." So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night, and left for Egypt. He remained there till the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Then when Herod saw he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged, and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all the vicinity from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted, because they are no more. So that's the text I decided to speak on, largely because it's Christmas time, and I thought I should say something about Christmas. But I'm going to do something a little bit different this morning. Normally when I preach from a text, I try and draw out the message of the text and apply it. But I'm going to do something a little bit more apologetics-based this morning. I don't normally do that in church sermons. There's two reasons I want to do that. One reason is at this time of the year, it's really popular in our society for people to pull things out of the media and say, this is a load of nonsense and here's why. So it's useful to reflect on why it's not a load of nonsense, right, at that period of time, and on the kinds of things you could say in response to it. But secondly, something about the Christmas season always troubles me, because the way our culture tells the nativity story, they make it out to be just another fairy tale. So it's mixed in with elves and Santa and reindeer and all this sort of stuff. And as a result, the story gets interpreted through a whole lot of cultural lens, which I think distort what's really going on in the story, and cease to make it look like a real historical event. So I'll give you some examples to draw this out. If you were at a trivia night and you got this question, what do you think most people would think the right answer to? The question is this: how many wise men came to see Jesus? 3, right? How many does Matthew's Gospel say? No. It doesn't say. It doesn't say, right? So the whole story of the 3, and it doesn't say wise men either, it says magi, by the way, and it doesn't say kings. So the whole story of the 3 kings becomes this whole thing. You ask most people, they'll tell you the Gospel says there's 3 kings. Why? Because that's what the Sin Nativity sings. Okay. Well, here's another one. Jesus born in a stable. Luke's Gospel was Jesus born in a stable.
It was a room in a house, wasn't it?
Correct, it was a room in the house, right? So it says he was born in a manger because there was no room. Sometimes it says in, and the assumption people make, I've seen nativity plays do this, is Joseph and Mary go and knock on the hotel door and there's no room, so they go to the stable around the back. They assume that ancient societies like Bethlehem, tiny villages, had big hotel systems, and people could come and pay for a hotel, check there was no vacancies, and if they didn't, the stable would be out the back. I mean, that's actually totally nonsense, right? A small village, you have the manger in the side of your house, you have a couple of rooms, one spare room, and if there's no room, you just sleep where the animals are, because you're a poor peasant living in first century Palestine, right? The reason I give those examples is, see how the story's been mythologized? See, it's been turned into this great fairy tale. So what I want to do is bring it down concrete. So you can kind of see what was going on in the time, and also give an idea of how you could respond to the kind of critical challenges that people will make. Okay, so I hope you'll bear with me, my indulgence this morning in doing that, right? So we're really going to look at 4 challenges that are standardly raised to Matthew's verse narrative. So the first regards the star. It's claimed that no star that moves or acts the way the Gospels describe, in Matthew's Gospel, could exist. No celestial object fits its description. The Gospel describes the star behaving in a way that we know stars do not behave in. Okay? Second, the significance. It's claimed that stars that were described would not have been interpreted as a sign of a king. They were always negative omens, right? I've seen this very commonly made. In fact, when I was researching for this, every now and then I'd put a Google search in and AI would come up to me and give me all the standard skeptical answers. It was really great. So then start feeding things back to the AI and you suddenly start noticing it contradicting itself and changing what it says as I get more information. It was really interesting to do. At one point I was thinking, oh man, I've got my facts right because they keep telling me different things. Every time I feed it into Google, the AI comes. And you realise that there's a sort of standard narrative, and then as people start to nuance it, the narrative starts to get, it's quite funny. The Magi would not have responded this way. And finally, that the story of the children being killed is contrary to what we know of Herod's reign. Okay, I'm going to address all 4 of these. And what this is going to do is it's kind of put this Matthew story in its historical context so you can see how it would have looked from a first century perspective. All right? So let's start first at the start. Okay, hang on. Can we get back? Yeah. The key problem that critics raise is the description of the movements of the star is allegedly outside what is physically possible for any observable sort of astronomical object. Matthew's Gospel describes 2 things. In verse 9, it says the star stopped, or stood, in fact it literally says stood, over the place where Jesus was born. And secondly, it says it went ahead of them. So let's look at this. The New American Standard Version, which I quoted, has until it stopped over the place where the child was. And I said before, the Greek is it stood over. What's meant by this phrase? Now here's the thing, if you're reading an ancient document and you see a phrase, what should you do to figure out what the phrase means? Should you think, it means what I think now in English today, or would you ask, how did ancient people use this phrase? Which would be the right question to ask. Right? Yeah, right. What would ancient people use this phrase, right? And this is really important when you're reading the Bible, is to be careful about smuggling your assumptions into the text and then finding a problem that's not there, right? So one question you can ask is, do we have examples of the same language being used elsewhere by Greco-Roman writers, and what were they describing when they did it? Okay, so let's have a look at this. So, 12 BC, famous Roman statesman and general Marcus Agrippa dies. The Roman historian Dio Cassius writes the following about his death. The death of Agrippa, far from being a private loss to his own household, was at any rate such a public loss to all the Romans that portents, that's omens, occurred on this occasion in such numbers that it want to happen when the greatest calamities befall a city. Owls kept flying around the city. Lightning struck a house on the side of the city, and a star called a comet stood or hung over the city for several days. See that phrase? The star hung over the city for several days. Right? That's very similar in the Greek to what you see in Matthew. Okay? So he uses the same language, right? Here's another one. Flavius Josephus. So this is from a book called The Jewish Wars. And I'll talk about Josephus a bit later because he's really important when you're studying the New Testament. And he wrote about the Jewish war against the Romans. He actually was an eyewitness to the Jewish war against the Romans, as I'll talk about a little bit later. He was actually one of the generals on the Jewish side, and he switched sides. And then he agreed that he would write on behalf of the Roman Emperor so that the Jews would understand his side of the story. And so he wrote about the Jewish wars. And he talks about in 66 AD, just before the war, they're deciding whether or not to go to war. And he says, there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city. And that's even closer to the language Matthew uses, right? So notice the language here is the same language used in Matthew. Both Josephus and Dio Cassius refer to a star. We know from the context that what they're referring to is what we call a comet, which can be used, the word star can be used for comet in ancient Greek. And they give a similar description. The star stands over the city. And in fact, you find that this language of a star standing over a city is actually typically used of comets in ancient Greco-Roman literature. And in fact, it's only used of comets in ancient Greco-Roman literature. So when people saw a comet, it was very common for them to describe it as a star standing over a city. It's an interesting point, right? And when you look at the examples of this language, you actually get a sense of what the phrase means, because Josephus says it stands, he gives more detail, he says it stands over the city like a sword. And often when they say it stands over a city, they use this language. So a Roman author, Massilian, has said it hangs like a column, like a sword. And this is the way ancient people described comets. Comets had tails that point away from the sun. And although they're always in motion, they move very slowly across the sky, so from a human observer they appear to stand in a particular spot, right? And so if you're in a particular place, you can see a comet with a tail, and the tail points like a sword over an object, and you think, oh, that's a sign about that object, right? Okay? So I did that Google search, and I thought, what happens if I use this language of, I use the language of star or comet standing over a city or hanging over a city in English, and typed into a Google search and see how modern people use the language. See if you've ever seen colloquial English people using this language. This is what I found. You can see it. Right. So that was Comet and Ewise 2020, and there's a photo. If you look up there, you can see the comet at the very top. You can see right up. I'll put a PowerPoint, yeah. Right. And this went viral because somebody took a photo of it, and all the captions said, Comet and Ewise stands in the sky or hangs in the sky over the pyramids. And this was viral. This language was everywhere, right? So now you look at that looks like it's standing over and pointing at the pyramid, doesn't it? That's quite well, that's right. All right. Now, so we get a sense of what's going on there. Now here's the question. When Cassius Day and Josephus said this, are they describing a real event, or are they just making up myths and legends? Anyone know what they're describing? Any guess? Yeah, well, NASA tells us that they're the only two references to Halley's Comet in ancient literature. Okay. So we know that when Josephus and Cassius Day use this language, they're referring to real things. In fact, they're referring to something that's well established, Halley's Comet. Okay. So when I found this out, well, that's really interesting. But then I found something else out. How do we know they refer to Halley's Comet? How do scientists know what people 2,000 years ago referred to? Now, Halley's Comet orbit is not regular. Gravitational and non-gravitational forces alter its path. So it doesn't come in a perfectly uniform amount. It's 2 or 3 years. Sometimes it comes 77, sometimes it comes 80, sometimes it comes 76, right? And this means if you're trying to track it back in time, you think about it, as you go further back in time, if it's a couple of years unpredictable, you go back to 800 AD and suddenly you can't track it at all. Your calculations are off the map, right? Because if you've got one or two wrong each time, it's suddenly added up over a huge amount, right? So what they do is they need anchor points, observations, to make an accurate prediction. And so they draw from the records of ancient people, because ancient people had groups called astrologers. Okay, the Bible calls them magi, but the ancient people had groups called astrologers. And astrologers actually looked at the sky and charted everything that they saw. And so we have copious records. And the best records we have come from the Han Dynasty in China. Okay? And it has all these records of, and what happened is the king of China, he wanted the people to advise him about the future, so he got people to keep records meticulously of all the things that happened in the sky. And it's these records that groups like NASA and scientists use to determine when Halley's Comet hit Rome. Guess what happens when you type in the date of birth, around the date of birth, into these records of China? Anyone guess? Is this known to you? Well, the records of the Han Dynasty tell us that Jesus is estimated to have been born somewhere between 6 and 4 BC. Okay? And we know that because Jesus is born during the reign of Herod, before Herod dies. And in Luke's Gospel, we're told he's approximately 30 years old when he's baptized by John the Baptist. Okay, so It's before Herod dies. Herod dies in 4 BC, and Herod dies early in 4 BC. So if Jesus is about 30 years old, and he's born before Herod dies, you end up about sort of 654 BC, roughly that period of time, right? If you look at the Chinese records from 5 BC, they say there was a major comet seen in the sky that was visible for 70 days, and they interpreted it. This is how they literally how they interpreted it. This shows the oldest being replaced by the new. That's actually, and I didn't get this from, popular sites. I actually got this from typing in about people who study ancient Chinese records and so on. So the Chinese recorded that there was a comet in early 5 BC, and they was visible for 70 days. This was during the monsoon season. Okay, so it was visible for 70 days with the equipment they had, which wasn't telescopes. Okay, and they said this is a sign that the oldest been replaced with the new, and they recorded it down in the records. Okay. Okay. So I want to put to you that if you're going to look at Josephus and Cassius Day and say they recorded a real event, and you're going to say they did because we can document it from Chinese records, you should say the same about Matthew's Gospel, shouldn't you? You know? So one thing you could say to people who criticise this is ask them if they believe that the Romans saw Halley's Comet or not, right? But what about the claim that the star led the Magi to Jerusalem? And here again, I want to stress, be careful about reading the text, because a lot of people interpret the story as though the star function is a kind of GPS system, and the Magi kind of followed the star around the sky and led to the place, right? It doesn't actually say that, if you look at Matthew 2. It says the Magi arrived at Jerusalem after a journey from the east. Think about if you travel from somewhere in the east, like Persia or Arabia, on foot or camel. It's not a short travel, right? They journeyed from the east, and they say they had seen, past tense, the star in the east. Right? They actually don't know where they're going. They go to Herod and go, where's this king? We have no idea where it is. Can you tell us where it is, please? Right? And then when they leave for Bethlehem, they notice the star again. And it says the star the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place the child was. Now this needs to be read carefully. The Greek text here is past tense. It says when they set off at Bethlehem, they noticed the star had already gone ahead of them and was now standing over the site they'd been, right? Now this phrase, the same phrase of going ahead of them, is used by Jesus when he says, tax collectors and prostitutes will get into the kingdom of heaven before you. Okay, it's not saying tax collectors and prostitutes will lead you into the kingdom of heaven like a GPS system. Okay, it's claiming if you go to a destination, these people are already there, and they got there before you did, right? So the idea is they leave, they move, and they look south. Oh my gosh, the star we saw in the east, it's over there now, right? It's moved around its position, right? And this is exactly the way comets behave, by the way. Comets move relative to the background sky at about 2 to 3 degrees a day. So if you see a comet in the east, and you take a 1 to 2 month journey to Jerusalem, it's actually not bizarre that you'll suddenly see it in a different part of the sky on the south, okay? And in fact, just while I was writing this, I discovered in the British Astronomical Society, somebody had looked at this Chinese comet and had done various mapping of it, and they found that this was one of the plausible ways it could have been observed, okay? So I think you can say with reasonable degree of confidence that it's plausible to suggest this is a real event. And if you were to approach this, I wouldn't approach the Bible the same way you just critically approach any historical document, because I think the Bible's the Word of God. But if you were to approach it that way, it seems to me kind of arbitrary to suggest that this is all made up and mythical, and yet take seriously claims by Josephus and Cassius Day and other Roman authors about the comets and things like that. But then you get to the second thing. People will often say, well, look, this isn't true because we know in the ancient world, comets were always interpreted negatively. They were always interpreted as a bad omen. And so they wouldn't have interpreted as heralded in the king. The first thing when you hear that is, how does Herod and people in Jerusalem interpret the news when they hear it? Positively or negatively? It says Herod was distressed, right? And it says the people of Jerusalem were stressed, and Herod's response is to go and murder some people, right? So the Gospel doesn't say it was interpreted positively, right? It says it was interpreted negatively, right? So even if you accept this, that's not contrary to what's said. But I actually think there's a real subtlety here that's missed. I want to show you a couple of things. So firstly, so here's how the scale was described, right? So you'll see there, notice that coin, can you see that? What that is? It's a star flying through the sky with a tail, right? Yeah. These are coins minted by Mithridates, king of Pontius, 134 to 63 BC. Okay? So he dies roughly 60 years before Christ is born, between 50 and 60 years, okay? You give an idea, I'm 51 years old, so that's the gap between him and Jesus, right? Roughly the gap from my birth to now, roughly, okay? Okay. Now Mithridates fought a series of wars against the Romans. And what's interesting is in his day, Persian and Zoroastrian traditions were being interpreted to interpret a saviour king that would overthrow Rome. And this is interesting because we know that Magi are Zoroastrian priests. Okay? And Mithridates got this information and he promoted himself as the fulfillment of these prophecies. And he said, I'm going to liberate you from Rome and I'm going to fight these wars. And you'll notice there are stars on his coins. And this is because when Mithridates was born, there was a comet seen in the sky. And he used the sign and said, look, this shows that I'm the Saviour King. I can defeat the Romans. And he put it on his coin so that all the citizens would know this. Right? Okay? So how did ancient people interpret stars and everything? Comets, right? Good your hands. Okay? Here's the next one. You might recognise this guy. He's a guy called Augustus Caesar, right? 63 BC to 19 AD, right? He's actually the emperor of Rome at the time Jesus is born, right? Now, Augustus Caesar is an interesting guy because Augustus Caesar we would call him the first emperor because he's sort of the first official emperor. Caesar gets murdered, right? His adopted father, Julius Caesar, gets murdered before he makes himself emperor. And Augustus Caesar was a really humble guy. He promoted himself as the Son of God, and these are the words he used in Greek: the Son of God, the Saviour of the world, Lord, and his reign was good news to all men. That's literally what Augustus Caesar said, right? Literally word for word what he says. And people have noticed this language, right? New Testament scholars will point to this language here when the New Testament writers are using it. It's just politically loaded language, right? That's why Christians got in trouble when they're preaching that Jesus was Lord and what have you, because many people say, you're saying Jesus has the role Caesar has. Okay? These coins here are part of Augustus's propaganda campaign. Okay? Notice what's on them. Yeah, see that? It says Divine Julius. So, Divine Julius. Look, there's a star, he's Divine Julius. Right? You can actually see that when you're looking at that in the words, you see what it says there. Okay. Now, what happened when Caesar died? He was murdered and he was assassinated around 45 BC, very sentenced as a stab of death. And there were some funeral games held for him at the time, shortly afterwards. And around that time, there was a comet seen in the sky. And citizens of Rome took this as evidence that the gods must have endorsed Julius Caesar, and he's now the Son of God. And so Augustus thought, well, this is pretty good because I'm Caesar's adopted son, right? So I'm going to run with this. And so he, on his coins, made clear to everybody that this star had appeared because it showed that he was the Son of God. Okay? So again, how did ancient people interpret stars and comets? What did they think they signified? Okay. And then the last one I mentioned Josephus is talking about a star standing over the city of Jerusalem. This occurred at the beginning of the Jewish rebellion against Rome around 66 AD. Now the rebels at the time, they were a group that are known to historians as zealots. And they were a group that started in Galilee around 6 AD. So when Jesus was about 10 years old or something like that, the zealots began operating in the very area he was working in. Okay? And they were a religious group that wanted to establish the kingdom of God by force, by violently overthrowing the Romans and establishing a messianic Davidic kingship by force, right? And in 66 AD, they take over sort of the leadership of the Jewish community, and they start a disastrous 7-year war against Rome, which results in the temple being destroyed about 3.5 years later. And anyway, what Josephus tells us is that when the Zealots saw Halley's comet, they said, this fulfills the prophecy that Messiah is going to come, we should go to war with the Romans. Okay. So when they saw a star standing over the city of Jerusalem, they took it as evidence the Messiah was about to come, and they took political action. Josephus, who's writing on behalf of the Romans, he's a Jew writing on behalf of the Romans, says, look, they misinterpreted the sign. The king that was coming was the Emperor Vespasian, who was going to conquer the Jewish people. You know, they were too ignorant to read the sign properly. So Josephus actually interprets it the same way. Slightly different, but he says, oh, it's the Roman kings that it's referring to. Right? So I want to suggest to you that if you look at major political events at the time of Jesus, they show that comets or stars appearing in the sky were not always interpreted as, oh, this is a negative omen. I mean, that would be a negative omen. If you are Roman and you think the Messiah is going to come, that's a negative omen. If you're Herod and you think a new king is going to come, that's a negative omen, right? But they were interpreted in certain contexts as signifying the rise of a new dynasty or significant king, right? And you can document this, right? Well, what would the Magi have read this way? Well, the Magi were Zoroastrian priests. And if you know, Zoroastrianism is actually a monotheistic religion that was practiced in Persia. It originated several hundred years before Christ. And it has this really strong emphasis on a conflict between good and evil. And so it has this whole story about good and evil and end of time. God's going to, the one true God is going to destroy evil and all this sort of stuff. If you want to see Zoroastrianism, read the book of Daniel. Daniel goes into Babylon and he deals with the high priest and what have you of the Persian king. Right? That's all Daniel interacting with Zoroastrianism, right? Now, you understand, this seems kind of weird to us today, but at the time of Jesus, Persia had become what's known as the Parthian Empire. Okay? You don't hear a lot about the Parthian Empire. We have a really interesting way of reading history. When I was at university, I had a friend who was born in Egypt and grew up in Kuwait. And we sat down and we discussed history. And I've been told, you know, there was this great empire by Alexander the Great, and then that got the next great empire was the Roman Empire. And you know, that's how I sort of understood history. And he understood, no, in actual fact there was this great empire called the Persian Empire, and some upstart from Greece called Alexander came over, beat it for a few years and then got killed, and his empire couldn't hold together. And then there was this major empire called the Parthian Empire, and they beat the Romans. They smashed the Romans, and the Romans were insignificant. And that was how my friend who was called in the Middle East was taught. And it really interested me because both those stories are actually true, if you think about it, right? And what happened is at the time of Jesus, the Parthian Empire was a major empire that spanned from Turkey to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it actually was on the border of Rome, the Roman Empire, and they had a struggle where they would from time to time have battles, and neither side clearly won. So the Romans tried to beat them and couldn't, and they sort of took the Romans on from time to time and they couldn't. So they had this kind of stalemate, these two rival major empires. And the region of Syria where Herod is smack on the border between them. It's on the edge of these two major empires. And Herod, in fact, had to play the Romans off against the Parthians to keep his position. Okay. And so Parthian Empire was seen as a major empire. And so Zoroastrian priests from the Parthian Empire were highly regarded. They were considered to be these great intellectuals because they were astrologers. Now to us, we think of astrology as you read the newspaper and you read some silly thing like this week something will happen positive in your career. Really? I wonder how you guess that, you know? But at this time, astrology was much more like a science. My colleagues in the science department are saying people balk at that. But you've got to understand, science as we know it today didn't exist until the 19th century. And so these people would have combined astronomy and astrology. So they would study the skies and the stars, and they would work out all kinds of theories about how they worked. And modern astronomy emerged out of this discipline. But they weren't secular, right? They interpreted the skies religiously at the same time. So they would have all these theories about planets and conjunctions and how they worked and everything. And so they would be considered highly educated people, full of the kind of wisdom of the world. And so emperors would use them as advisors. So they're highly regarded people. Now, I tried to do a little bit of research into this, and it was hard to sort of get things because a lot of the originals are not translated and what have you. But what I did discover which is really interesting, was this. One is that one aspect of ancient astrology was what they call astrological geography. And the idea was that you would map the constellations onto regions, and if something happened in the constellation, it would tell you what happened in that region. And at the time of Jesus, there was a kind of Hellenistic Babylonian astrology, and it mapped Capricorn as the region of Syria. That's where the Chinese saw their comet, by the way. The region of Capricorn. Right. So, and secondly, from what I understand from their writings, if a comet lasted a long period of time, that was taken as a sign of political upheaval, long-term change. That's why the Chinese wrote what they did. So they literally saw in the region of Syria there will be some political upheaval, some political change under the charts they had, right? Another thing that comes up in these discussions is the date. The comet was in 5 BC, but there was just before that a series of conjunctions between Jupiter and Saturn. There were 3. That may not much match to you, but Jupiter and Saturn have a conjunction every 20 years, but 3 occurring in a row occurs only 800 years. 800 years. So from an ancient astrological perspective, this would be really significant. And conjunctions between Saturn and Jupiter are seen as the sign of a new king or a new age of stability in astrological traditions at the time.
Yeah. What does that mean, conjunction? Do they join?
So they come together, they move, so from the human perspective, they look like they've come together. Obviously they haven't, but they come really close. Okay? And there are all kinds of weird theories these people had about the sky, right? And one of them was that Jupiter and Saturn, they signify certain things, and so them coming together is like king, stability, this and stuff, right? So it seems to me not implausible that the Magi would have interpreted the way the text says here, right? I think if you say that it's completely implausible, you're wrong, okay? Or at least it's not as simple as that. So the last one we'll look at is Herod's response. So let's look at the 4th issue. And this comes up, you'll probably see this, I've seen this written in places like New Zealand Herald and all over the place. The idea is that Herod's order to kill the children in Bethlehem it's not plausible given what we know about Herod. So if you look online, you'll see comments like this. The ancient historian Josephus extensively recorded Herod's crimes and does not mention this baby murdering, which would have undoubtedly been Herod's greatest crime by far. And you'll hear this said over and over again, right? So let me just explain this so you understand what they're getting at, and then I'll talk about it a bit. So outside the New Testament, our best historical source for the reign of Herod, who's ironically known as Herod the Great, you'll see why that's ironic in a minute, is the guy I mentioned earlier, Josephus, Flavius Josephus. Now Flavius Josephus lived from 37 AD to 100 AD. So he was born after Jesus. He was born just after Jesus' sort of crucifixion and resurrection, probably 4 years after that, 7 to 4 years. He's a contemporary of the Apostle Paul, and he's writing at the same time the Gospels have been written, roughly. Okay. Now, when the Jews rebelled against Rome, Josephus initially fought on the side of the Jews, and then he was captured. And when he was captured, he switched sides. As he tells the story, it's really funny. He gets captured. He says he's a prophet, and he gets captured, and he goes up to the Roman general and says, I have a prophecy. You are going to be Caesar. And suddenly the general really liked Josephus, and so Josephus decides to write a history of what's happening so that his people, he writes 2 histories. One to tell the Jewish people that really, the Romans are the good guys in this, and the second one he writes later is to introduce the Roman people and the Jewish people, to bring people to the Jewish culture. So he writes, and he documents the reign of Herod. So he had all these sources of his time, and he talks about Herod, and most of these sources are now lost, so he's now our only source for Herod, the only one we have historically, right? And he mentions many awful atrocities Herod commits, okay? But he doesn't mention the killing of the children, right? And so the argument is, well, look, Herod, Joseph, he mentions all the atrocities that Herod committed. He doesn't mention this one, so it didn't happen, okay? So I want to think, firstly, you need to realise, firstly, that the killing of the children in Bethlehem under 2 probably wouldn't have been seen as Herod's greatest crime, or even a hugely significant crime by Herod. Okay, now that sounds really shocking to us. Based on what we know of demographics, Bethlehem was a small village. It was between 300 to 1,000 people. That means if you looked at children under 2, which, by the way, children under 2 in this way of counting that they had means born last year or this year. Okay? It doesn't mean literally 2 years, right? So a village of that size probably would have had about maybe 8 to 28 male children. Okay? So this actually wouldn't have been a massive, and when you hear it later, you'll see this actually isn't from his perspective a terribly significant massacre. Obviously this is dreadful from our perspective, but it's not obvious that this is the most significant atrocity that somebody who was writing about all its crimes and had a political and religious orientation or what have you that wasn't Christian would even mention. You'll see that in a moment. So Josephus doesn't mention this. This is what he does mention though, right? So he tells us that in 30 BC, Herod executed Hieronychus II. And Hieronychus II was a former high priest, and he was a potential rival to the throne. And so he had been captured by the Parthian Empire, and so he negotiates for Hieronychus to be given back to him, and then he kills him. So that way the potential rival to the throne's gone, right? Okay. 29 BC, so he kills his wife out of jealousy. Okay. Next year, he kills his wife's mother out of jealousy. And all these situations happen. What happened is, in his family, someone would say, "Hey, I think your wife's trying to overthrow you." And you, "Oh, what?" And he would hear this rumor, and he would kind of start torturing people to figure out about the rumor. And of course, you torture people and say, "Is this true?" They go, "Yes, just stop the torture." You know, that sort of thing. And so, "Oh, this is true." And so he kills his wife, kills his mother, right? Getting close to Jesus' birth, 6 BC, he kills his sons, Aristobulus and Alexander, suspecting them of plotting against him, right? Okay. 4 BC, he executes one of his other sons, Antipater, okay, who he again suspects of plotting against him, okay? And when he dies in 4 BC, he orders that all the prominent Jewish leaders attend a gathering. Why? Well, because he wanted them all to be in one place, and then he gave the order to his soldiers, "When I die, I want you to go into that place and kill every one of them. Because I'm so hated by my people, nobody's going to mourn me. But if I kill all the major leaders of Jerusalem, every family in the area will be mourning." And this order was not carried out. After he died, the soldiers said, "I'm going to do that." So these are the explicit ones they mention. Notice these are mentioned, these are high-profile political killings that are mentioned, right? But it doesn't mention the children, okay? But I'm going to suggest to you, this isn't as significant as you think it is either. Firstly, notice these are high-profile political killings, right? They're ones that get the kind of news, if you like. But when I actually did something a few years ago, I actually read Josephus, which most people don't do. And I was really interested when I came across it, because one of the things Josephus tells us is that he doesn't document every single atrocity Herod did. He actually tells us, there are a lot more bad stuff Herod did I'm not going to tell you about. He explicitly says that. So this is what he says about the death of Herod. Herod, having survived a long illness, departed this life. Having lived about 70 years and having reigned 37, he was a man of great fortune and success in what he undertook, but of a cruel and tyrannical disposition. Look at this phrase. No one was free from danger under him, for he watched everyone with suspicion, and there was no end to his cruelty, nor any bounds to his anger. Does that sound like a guy who did a few high-profile political killings and nothing else? Or does that sound like a guy who did a lot of really bad, suspicious, paranoid abductions, killings, and what have you, which Josephus doesn't mention? Right? Josephus is, obviously he says everyone, and there's obvious exaggeration, but Josephus is telling us here that he's really just scraped the tip of the iceberg here, right? He's telling us there's a lot more that happened that I'm not talking about. So when you say this, it just seems to me it's obvious that Josephus doesn't mention every single killing, right? But there's also something really interesting in Josephus, and that's an incident that does mention that you often don't hear a lot about. And this is around 6 BC. So notice the date, around 6 BC. The Jewish leaders are all supposed to register to a certain place to swear goodwill to Caesar, around 6 BC. And Josephus tells us that 6,000 men of the sect of the Pharisees refused. And so he doesn't want to cause a stir, so he finds them. But then he discovers something about the Pharisees. They, the Pharisees, were believed to have foreknowledge of things come by divine inspiration. And they told how God had decreed that Herod's government would cease, and his posterity should be deprived of it, but the kingdom should come to her, that's in the name of the person, and her children. These predictions were not concealed from Solomon was someone in Herod's household, but were told to the king. Okay? So that's what Herod hears. So the Pharisees, they refuse to swallow an oath of allegiance. There's 6,000 of them, he finds them. Then he hears that the Pharisees have been teaching that there's a prophecy that his kingdom's going to be overthrown. You know what Herod does? Well, what he does is he kills everybody who taught this prophecy and everybody in his own household who had heard the prophecy and given credit to it. Right? And then Josephus says this. Now, when Herod had done these things, he was in great uneasiness and his mind disordered. Sounds like what Matthew's Gospel described, doesn't it? And was in fear of everybody, so he increased his guards and watched those around about him. He sent spies everywhere and caught many that were accused and punished them. And so much there was no end of his suspicions, nor of the examinations and the tortures he inflicted upon those who were accused. For some were slain, and others were tormented without any proof of their guilt. And this was the condition of Herod when he was in his old age, when he was in the last years of his reign. Right? That's 6 BC. So Josephus tells us that in 6 BC, Herod basically has heard a prophecy about his kingdom being overthrown, and he's implemented his reign of terror, and he's just pulling people up randomly and torturing and killing them on the merest suspicion that his kingdom is going to be overthrown or another king's going to come. Right? And untold countless people, who Josephus doesn't explicitly mention, were executed, killed, tortured, subject to suspicion, and what have you. Okay? So Josephus is telling us at this point in history there were large numbers of people killed by Herod who doesn't even mention. And he tells us why. Why? Because they believed prophecies about a future king coming. Right? So when I read this, and then I read online skeptics saying, what we know about Herod from Josephus tells us that he could not possibly have done this. I'm done. What Josephus have you read? Right? Herod was called Herod the Great because he did great buildings. He did renovations to the temple and things like that. But as you'll see, he's not really a great guy, right? Until Matthew goes, Herod the king, all the Jewish people reading it, oh yeah, anyway. Yeah, we know that is right. Okay, so this topic has become rather grim, but I hope what I've said encourages you when you read Matthew's Gospel this Christmas. And I think if you look at what we do that in context, we'll see the following things. 1, Matthew uses language commonly used to describe comets, to describe the Star of the Beast. 2, the same records were used to verify that Halley's Comet was seen in 1266 BC. By authors using the same language show us that a comet also appeared at the time of Jesus' birth. Not Halley's Comet, but a comet. Right? Comets were interpreted as signifying and validating saviour, kings and messiahs, and kings' reign and change of reigns in the 1st century. And we see that from political events that I showed you. And the comet would have been of some significance to the astrologers of the day. Right? What we know of Herod makes the story of the killing of children very critical. I think that's, okay. So before I kind of close, you might think, sometimes I'll say things like this and people think, look, you're trying to get a modern scientific on the spin on the story, you're retreating from an ancient story that's primitive and superstitious, and you're making it sort of scientific, and this is this kind of new idea. So I want to actually suggest to you that what I'm saying to you today is not new at all. Early in the early church, Christian writers, Christian apologists responded to skeptics who were writing in the early Roman Empire. Okay? And here is a quote from the early church father Origen, who lived from 185 to 253 AD. This is the first discussion we have in any depth of the star passage in Matthew's Gospel. And he's responding to a skeptic called Celsius. And you'll see this is what he says. Let us see now what answer you make to these statements. The star that was seen in the east we consider to have been a new star. Unlike any of the other well-known planetary bodies, rather those in the firmament above or lower orbs, but partaking of the nature of those celestial bodies which appear at times, such as comets. It has been observed that in the occurrence of great events and of mighty changes in terrestrial things, which such stars are wont to appear, indicating the removal of dynasties or the breaking out of wars, or the happening of such circumstances as may cause commotions upon earth. If then at the commencement of new dynasties, or on the occasion of other important events, there arises a comet or any other celestial body, why should it be a matter of wonder that him, at the birth of him who was to introduce a new doctrine to this human race and to make it known, God made his teaching known not only to Jews but to Greeks and many other barbarous nations. Right. So, Oregon is saying basically what I've said, right? Oregon is saying, the Star of Bethlehem, you know what that is, that's a comet, and you know how comets are interpreted in your culture. They're interpreted as showing a major change, and this was God's way of announcing to the pagan world the message that he was also announcing to the Jewish world. Right? Okay. And I also want you to look carefully at that Renaissance picture from the Nativity. Look above the Nativity. And you'll find that in ancient Christian iconography, the Star of Bethlehem is frequently portrayed as a comet. Not a new idea. Old one. Anyway, I hope that's helpful to you. I hope that's encouraging. I don't claim to be infallible on this. These are my opinions. They're based on the research I've done, but I hope that's helpful and I hope that's encouraging.